Sabrina's champagne glass caught the light as she turned toward our table. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 23 minutes. Beyond the garden doors, the string quartet was tuning beside an aisle lined with white roses. "Before I walk down that aisle," my sister said, smiling beneath the floral arch, "I should thank Camille." Polite applause moved through the cocktail room. Beside me, Elsie straightened in her chair. Sabrina had barely spoken to us all afternoon. She had removed my daughter from the family photographs, changed our seats twice, and told the photographer that Elsie was not part of the direct line. Still, for one hopeful second, Elsie believed her aunt was about to apologize. Sabrina placed a hand over her heart. "Camille has always had a gift for taking in whatever other people leave behind and calling it love." A few guests laughed. My mother raised her glass as if the line had been rehearsed. Then Sabrina looked directly at Elsie. "Sweetheart, enjoy the flowers, the dress, and the photographs. This may be the closest you ever come to seeing what a complete family looks like." I pushed back my chair. "Sabrina, that's enough." She lifted her glass higher. "Some girls inherit their mother's eyes. You inherited her talent for being left. A fatherless burden no one will ever want." Elsie's breath caught. Her hand closed over the silver bracelet at her wrist. Lorraine gave a small laugh from the family table. "She's only telling the truth," my mother said. "Just like her mother." A chair scraped across the floor. Gabriel stood, crossed the room, and took the microphone from Sabrina's hand. "Put the cameras down," he said. "No one records another second of this." Phone slowly disappeared. Sabrina reached for the microphone, but Gabriel stepped away. "You told me the child you delivered at 17 died before you ever held her." The blood drained from my hands. Gabriel was not revealing to me that Sabrina had given birth. I had carried that child out of the hospital myself. What I did not understand was why he had been told she died, or how many versions of that night my mother had created. "The medical history you gave me records a live birth," Gabriel continued. "After what I just heard, I no longer believe the rest of your story." Sabrina's glass slipped onto the carpet. Gabriel looked through the garden doors at the waiting aisle. "You do not get to call a child unwanted just to bury your own secret. There will be no ceremony. Stay with me to discover why my sister denied the daughter she had given birth to, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened when I finally opened the records my family had kept buried for 13 years. 3 hours earlier, Elsie sat beside me in the car, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress over her knees as we left Hawthorne. Cedar Vale Estate was 50 minutes away, and for most of the drive she pretended the view outside interested her more than the wedding. "Do you think Aunt Sabrina really wanted me there?" she asked at last. She addressed the invitation to both of us. "That isn't what I asked." At 13, Elsie had become skilled at locating the space between what adults said and what they meant. I kept my eyes on the road. "I think she wants today to go exactly as she planned," I said. "I also think you have every right to attend a family wedding you were invited to." Elsie turned the silver bracelet around her wrist. A small letter E hung from its chain. It was the only object that had come with her from the hospital, and she had worn it since she was old enough not to lose it. I could have refused the invitation. Sabrina and I had spent years communicating through holiday cards, carefully worded messages, and our mother. But Elsie still wanted a grandmother and an aunt. She should not have had to pay for conflicts that began before she could speak. My mother had always divided her daughters into fixed roles. Sabrina was the brilliant one, the child whose future required protection. I was the reasonable one, which usually meant I was expected to absorb whatever damage remained after everyone else had been rescued. At 26, I had agreed to care for Sabrina's newborn daughter. Temporary care became bedtime stories, school forms, fevers, scraped knees, and eventually a legal adoption. Elsie knew she was adopted. She did not know the young mother I had described was the aunt whose wedding we were driving toward. Cedar Vale looked like a place designed to keep ordinary life outside its gates. White stone buildings stood above trimmed lawns, and staff members in pale gray uniforms directed cars toward the circular drive. Elsie glanced at the flower arrangements and smiled despite herself. Sabrina met us near the bridal suite. She kissed the air beside my cheek, then looked Elsie over from shoes to hair. Her smile stopped when she saw the bracelet. "You wore that?" she asked. Elsie touched it. "I always do. It doesn't match the dress. Take it off before the photographs." The request sounded casual, but Sabrina's fingers had gone still around her bouquet. I saw the same bracelet as I always had, a thin chain worn smooth by years against Elsie's skin. Sabrina saw something else. "It belongs to me," Elsie said calmly. "I'm keeping it on." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lorraine appeared behind Sabrina and announced that the photographer was waiting. My mother gave Elsie a quick inspection, as if assessing whether she would lower the value of the pictures, and led us toward the terrace. The photographer arranged Lorraine, Sabrina, and me beneath an arch of climbing roses. "Elsie can stand beside Camille," Gabriel suggested. Sabrina answered before I could. "This one is just the 3 generations of Dawson women." Elsie looked from my mother to my sister, and then at me. "Aren't I one of them?" Sabrina adjusted her veil. "We're doing the direct family line first." The words struck harder because they were technically absurd. Elsie was related to every woman beneath that arch in more ways than she knew. Lorraine said nothing. She merely placed a hand at my back and urged me into position. "I'm not taking that photograph without her," I said. Sabrina's jaw tightened. "Then step out. We're already behind schedule." I left the arch and stood beside Elsie. The shutter clicked while my mother and sister smiled as if nothing had happened. Gabriel watched us from the edge of the terrace. His attention dropped to Elsie's bracelet and remained there long enough for me to notice. When the photographer moved to the next group, he approached me. "Camille, can I ask you something about Elsie?" Before I could answer, the wedding coordinator hurried over and told him the officiant needed him in the garden. Gabriel hesitated, glanced once more at the bracelet, and followed her away. That look settled uneasily in my stomach. I told Elsie we could leave before the ceremony. She had endured enough, and no invitation obligated her to remain where she was being treated as an embarrassment. Sabrina overheard us. "You can't leave yet. I prepared a special thank you for Camille during the family cocktail." I did not trust the sweetness in her voice. Elsie did. She looked at me with cautious hope. "Maybe she knows the pictures were mean," she whispered. "Can we stay until she says it?" Every instinct told me to take my daughter home, but hope had already softened her face, and I could not bear to be the one who extinguished it. So we stayed. At 5:07, Sabrina stepped beneath the floral arch and lifted her champagne glass. "Before I walk down that aisle," she said, "I should thank my sister Camille." The quartet had stopped tuning outside, leaving the cocktail room strangely quiet. Guests turned toward us with glasses suspended near their mouths. Elsie sat straighter beside me, hope briefly returning to her face. She still believed Sabrina might apologize for excluding her from the photographs. Sabrina smiled at me as though we shared a private joke. "Camille has always been the responsible one. She takes whatever other people leave behind, fixes it up, and calls it love." A handful of Sabrina's friends laughed without hesitation. Others followed a second later because laughter was expected during a wedding speech. Gabriel did not join them. He stood near the garden doors with his hands folded in front of him, watching Sabrina rather than the guests. I felt Elsie's shoulders stiffen against mine. "Sabrina," I said quietly. She heard the warning and ignored it. My sister has always been generous that way. She never asks whether something belongs to her. She just decides she can give it a better life. The second wave of laughter was weaker. A woman near the bar lowered her phone. An older man at Gabriel's family table glanced at him, apparently waiting for some indication that the joke was acceptable. Sabrina turned toward Elsie. "And she brought my niece tonight." Elsie looked down at her lap. Her fingers found the silver bracelet and pulled it beneath the cuff of her sleeve. "Sweetheart, I hope you enjoy the flowers, the beautiful dresses, and all the family photographs," Sabrina continued. This may be the closest you ever come to seeing what a complete family looks like." The room did not laugh that time. One woman gave a startled sound that died halfway through. A man near the windows examined the floor as though he had suddenly discovered something important in the carpet. Several guests still held their phones up, but their smiles had disappeared. I pushed my chair back. "That's enough." Sabrina tilted her head. "I'm making a toast." "No, you're humiliating a child." "I'm telling the truth. You've spent 13 years pretending truth and kindness are the same thing." Elsie pressed both palms against the skirt of her dress. She did not cry or ask me to defend her. She drew her elbows inward and lowered her chin, making herself smaller in the chair as if disappearing would cause less trouble than being protected. That hurt more than anything Sabrina had said. I stood and reached for Elsie. "We're leaving." Sabrina lifted her glass higher. "Some girls inherit their mother's eyes. Elsie inherited her talent for being left." Her gaze moved between my daughter and me. She knew exactly where to strike, and for one terrible second, I saw the frightened 17-year-old she had once been hiding behind the woman in the wedding dress. Then her mouth curved into a smile, and whatever sympathy I might have felt vanished. "A fatherless burden no one will ever want," she said. A few people at the far table laughed, before realizing no one else was joining them. One of them coughed and reached for his drink. The photographer lowered his camera. Two guests turned their phones face down on the table. My mother's voice came from behind Sabrina. "She's only telling the truth, just like her mother." Lorraine did not sound angry. She sounded satisfied, as if Sabrina had finally delivered a line they had practiced, and I had reacted exactly as expected. I looked at her across the room. "Which mother are you talking about?" Her expression tightened for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered and raised her chin. "Don't make a scene, Camille." Elsie's fingers had closed around the bracelet beneath her sleeve. I could see the shape of the small letter E pressed against the fabric. A chair scraped against the floor. Gabriel crossed the room without hurrying. He did not look at me or Elsie. He stopped beside Sabrina and held out his hand for the microphone. She gave a nervous laugh. "Gabriel, I'm almost finished." "I know." Something in his voice made her grip loosen. He took the microphone, turned toward the guests, and spoke without raising his voice. "Put the cameras down. No one records another second of this." Several phones disappeared immediately. One guest hesitated until Gabriel looked directly at him. Then he lowered his hand. Sabrina reached for the microphone. "You're overreacting to a family joke." Gabriel stepped beyond her reach. "You told me the child you delivered at 17 died before you ever held her." The room seemed to contract around that sentence. Sabrina's face lost its color. Lorraine rose so quickly that her chair struck the table behind her. I remained standing beside Elsie, but my hand went cold around hers. Gabriel was not telling me Sabrina had given birth. I had carried that child out of the hospital myself. I had known for 13 years whose body had brought Elsie into the world. What I had never known was that Sabrina had told Gabriel the baby died. "That is private medical information," Lorraine said sharply. "It was information Sabrina voluntarily gave me when we discussed having children," Gabriel replied. "She told me there had been a pregnancy and a death. The medical history she provided records a live birth." Sabrina shook her head. "You don't understand the terminology. A live birth can still result in an infant death. That record proves nothing." "You are right. By itself, it does not prove where that child is now." His eyes moved toward Elsie, then immediately returned to Sabrina. He did not say her name. He did not expose what he could not yet prove. "But I watched you remove Elsie from every family photograph today. I watched your mother panic over a bracelet. Then I listened to you call a 13-year-old girl unwanted because she has no father standing beside her." "You went through my things," Sabrina said. "You asked me to scan documents for you." Camille's letter fell out of the folder. My stomach tightened. I had written Sabrina more than one letter over the years. I did not know which one Gabriel had found, or why she had kept it. Sabrina glanced toward the garden doors. Through the glass, the white chairs waited beneath the trees. The officiant stood near the aisle, still unaware that the wedding had already ended. "Gabriel, please," she said. "We can talk after the ceremony." "No." It was the first time his voice sharpened. "You do not get to call a child unwanted just to bury your own secret." He removed the ring he had planned to wear after their vows and placed it on the table beside her champagne glass. "There will be no ceremony." For several seconds, no one moved. Then the room broke into overlapping voices. The wedding coordinator rushed in from the garden. Someone asked whether the guests should leave. Sabrina's maid of honor began crying. Lorraine pushed through the gathering toward me. "We need to speak privately," she said. "I'm taking Elsie home. You cannot walk out before we understand what he has. I understand what happened to my daughter in this room." Lorraine caught my arm. Her fingers dug through the fabric of my sleeve. "If Gabriel starts digging into old records, this will not stop with Sabrina. Your adoption was built on circumstances you never questioned. If the past is reopened, you could lose Elsie." The threat entered exactly where she intended it to. For 13 years, I had feared some person or document would decide that bedtime stories, school pickups, fevers, birthday cakes, and thousands of ordinary mornings did not make me a mother. Elsie looked up at me. She had heard every word. I removed Lorraine's hand from my arm. "Do not touch me again. Camille, I'm trying to protect you. You have called control protection for my entire life." I led Elsie toward the exit. Gabriel followed us only as far as the front hall. "I have very little," he said. "A medical history Sabrina gave me, and a letter with a photograph attached. I'll send copies to you. Nothing goes to the guests or online." "Why didn't you speak to me before today?" "I should have. I kept hoping there was an explanation that did not destroy the life we had planned." There was no pride in his answer, only regret. Behind him, Sabrina called his name. Lorraine called mine. Neither Elsie nor I turned around. We reached the car beneath a sky that had darkened without rain. Elsie climbed into the passenger seat, closed the door, and stared through the windshield while I started the engine. I drove beyond the estate gates before pulling onto the shoulder. Her hands remained folded tightly in her lap. The bracelet was visible again. "Mom," she said, "was I the baby he was talking about?" For years, I had answered difficult questions with softer versions of the truth. That habit had helped build the silence that brought us here. "Yes," I said. "You were the baby Gabriel was talking about." Elsie did not ask another question on the side of the road. She turned toward the dark windshield and pulled the cuff of her dress over the silver bracelet. I waited for anger, tears, or disbelief, but she only asked me to drive home. The 50 minutes back to Hawthorne passed in silence. I kept both hands on the wheel and felt every mile carrying us farther from the wedding, but no closer to safety. I had always believed the truth would become easier when Elsie was older. Instead, I had allowed it to grow roots beneath our lives until one sentence from Gabriel tore through the floor. At home, Elsie walked directly upstairs. She did not change out of her dress or ask for food. Her bedroom door closed with a soft click. I stood in the hallway outside long enough to hear the clasp of her bracelet open. A moment later, metal touched wood as she placed it on her bedside table. That bracelet had soothed her through vaccinations, the first day of school, and every night she woke from a bad dream. Now it was no longer an object she trusted. It was evidence that the adults around her had known a story she did not. I went downstairs without knocking. For the first time in 13 years, protecting Elsie meant giving her space from me. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter at 9:18. The message came from Gabriel. "I am sorry this reached Elsie in a room full of strangers. I should have spoken to you earlier. I said only what was necessary to stop Sabrina from continuing. I did not tell anyone that Elsie was the child, and I will not release anything without your permission." A second message followed. "I have 3 items. They are not a complete answer. They are only the reasons I could no longer accept Sabrina's explanation. 3 attachments appeared beneath it. The first was a page from the medical history Sabrina had voluntarily provided when she and Gabriel began discussing children. Most of it was ordinary. Allergies, surgeries, medications, family conditions. Under obstetric history, one line had been circled. Pregnancies, 1. Live births, 1. Maternal age at delivery, 17. There was no infant death recorded on that page. It did not prove what happened afterward, but it contradicted the version Sabrina had given Gabriel, that the baby had died before she ever held her. I enlarged the image until the letters blurred. Sabrina had not merely avoided telling him about Elsie. She had built a dead child between them and expected him never to ask where that child had been buried. The second attachment was a photograph of a letter in my own handwriting. For a moment I could not remember when I had written it. Then I recognized the pale blue stationery I used when Elsie was 6. Sabrina had visited us after missing 2 birthdays in a row. Elsie had followed her around the house with a paper crown she had made at school, asking whether Sabrina wanted to see her room. Sabrina stayed 20 minutes, spent most of them checking her phone, and later told me I should stop treating my responsibility as a family obligation everyone else had to share. That night, I wrote her a letter because I believed ink might reach a place conversation could not. You do not have to be her mother, but you do not get to make her feel like your shame. Gabriel's photograph showed the folded page beside a folder labeled Personal. Sabrina had kept it for 7 years. I had once interpreted her silence as avoidance. Now I wondered whether she had preserved the letter because it named precisely what she was doing. The third attachment took several seconds to load. It was a photograph of Sabrina at 17, sitting upright in a hospital bed. Her face was pale and swollen from crying. A blue blanket rested in her arms, and inside it was a newborn whose cheek pressed against the fabric of Sabrina's gown. The image pulled the air from my lungs. I had seen Sabrina hold Elsie only once. Lorraine had told me she refused. I remembered entering the room after the nurse called and finding Sabrina turned toward the window, her arms empty. My mother said the baby had already been taken away, but the photograph showed a different moment. Sabrina was looking down at the child, not with disgust or indifference, but with naked grief. Around the baby's wrist was a thin silver chain with a small letter E. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date. It was Elsie's birthday. I sent Gabriel one question. Where did you find this? His reply came immediately. Inside the same folder as your letter. Sabrina asked me to scan documents for our insurance and fertility consultation. The letter and photograph slipped from a sealed envelope. I photographed them because they did not match what she had told me. I know I should have contacted you then. Gabriel had delayed because he wanted his future to survive. I had delayed because I wanted mine to remain unchanged. The motives were different, but Elsie had paid for both. I thanked him and told him not to contact Sabrina about the files. Then I went to the hall closet and pulled down the gray fireproof box containing Elsie's adoption records. I had opened that box for school enrollment, passports, and insurance forms. I had never opened it looking for deception. Sabrina's consent was there, signed 3 days after Elsie's birth. My own petition followed. Then came the social worker's report, the home assessment, the court order, and the notice concerning the child's biological father. I read that page 3 times. Paternity had not been legally established. There was no signed relinquishment from Jonah Reed. No document showed that he had voluntarily surrendered parental rights. The file described the father as unconfirmed and unable to be contacted. Notice had been mailed to an address Lorraine supplied, then returned as undeliverable. I knew the address. It belonged to Jonah's father's old repair shop, which had closed before Elsie was born. My mother had told me Jonah disappeared after learning Sabrina was pregnant. She said he refused every call, moved without leaving an address, and wanted no connection to the baby. I had accepted her account because I was 26, frightened, and suddenly responsible for a newborn. The record did not prove Jonah wanted Elsie. It proved only that the legal process had never heard directly from him. My first reaction shamed me. I did not think about a young man who might have been denied the chance to know his child. I did not think about Elsie's right to understand where she came from. I imagined a stranger appearing at our door, a judge reviewing old fraud, and someone deciding that 13 years of motherhood could be undone by a missing signature. I pressed the court order flat against the table, as if holding the paper down could hold my life in place. The stairs creaked behind me. Elsie stood in the kitchen doorway wearing pajamas, her face scrubbed clean. The bracelet was no longer on her wrist. "I heard the printer," she said. I had printed Gabriel's attachments without realizing the sound carried upstairs. The hospital photograph lay face up beside the adoption file. Elsie approached slowly. Her eyes moved from Sabrina's face to the bundle in her arms. Then she touched the image of the bracelet. "That's mine." "Yes. She had it before you did." "Yes." Elsie looked at me. "Is Aunt Sabrina the person who gave birth to me?" There was no useful way to soften the answer. "She is." Her expression did not break. It emptied. I reached toward her, then stopped before touching her. "I was going to tell you when you were older. I thought I was protecting you from a choice Sabrina made when she was 17. You let me sit beside her at Christmas." "I know. You let me call her Aunt Sabrina." "Yes." "You watched her pretend she barely knew me." Each sentence removed another excuse I had prepared over the years. Elsie looked again at the photograph, at the girl in the hospital bed holding the baby she would later call a burden. "How long have you known she was my mother?" "Since the day you were born," I said again. Elsie stared at me as though the kitchen floor had shifted beneath her. The hospital photograph remained between us, Sabrina's 17-year-old face bent over the newborn in her arms. Elsie touched the silver bracelet in the picture, then looked toward the stairs where she had left the same bracelet on her bedside table. "You knew she was my mother every time she came to our house? Every Christmas? Every birthday she forgot?" "Yes," I said. "I knew." Her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Then tell me everything. Not the careful version you think I can handle." I looked at Sabrina's signature on the consent form, and the kitchen disappeared beneath a memory I had spent 13 years arranging into something easier to live with. Before the pregnancy, Sabrina had been the kind of girl adults displayed as proof of good parenting. She earned top grades, played violin in the regional youth orchestra, and could argue both sides of a debate without losing her smile. Lorraine kept her calendar color-coded and her dresses pressed. Every photograph had to look effortless, even after our mother spent an hour correcting Sabrina's posture. I loved my sister, but I envied the way Lorraine praised her. Sabrina was called exceptional. I was called dependable, which meant I was useful whenever exceptional people created problems. Sabrina met Jonah Reed during a summer reading drive at the Hawthorne Library. I was working there part-time and coordinating volunteers. Jonah arrived in work boots after a shift at his father's repair shop, carrying 3 boxes of donated children's books. He shelved the books incorrectly, then stayed late helping Sabrina fix them. He was not polished enough for Lorraine. He had grease beneath his fingernails, drove an old pickup, and planned to train as an emergency medical technician instead of attending a prestigious university. But around him, Sabrina could make mistakes. He laughed when she dropped a box, let her complain about violin practice, and never asked what rank she held in her class. I met him several times that summer. He was shy with me, but serious about her. Once, while Sabrina was in the restroom, he asked whether Lorraine would ever give him a chance. I told him our mother rarely changed her mind about people. He said he would keep showing her he intended to stay. By October, Sabrina was pregnant. She came to my apartment after midnight wearing a sweatshirt over her school uniform. Her hands shook so badly she could not hold the test straight. She said she loved Jonah, but she also said Lorraine would destroy both of them. Our mother arrived 40 minutes later. Sabrina had called her before coming to me. Lorraine looked at the test, sat at my small kitchen table, and began making decisions before asking Sabrina what she wanted. Sabrina would finish the semester from home, The school would be told she was receiving treatment for a severe autoimmune condition. Jonah would be cut off until Lorraine decided whether his involvement was useful. I would return to Belmere whenever I was needed, because, as Lorraine put it, family solved family mistakes quietly. I did not call her a mistake, I told Elsie. But you stayed, she said, and I admitted that I had. During the pregnancy, Lorraine controlled Sabrina's phone mail and appointments. Jonah's messages disappeared. When Sabrina asked about him, Lorraine said he had panicked and stopped calling. I believed our mother had facts I did not. Sabrina believed it because she was 17, isolated, and terrified. She gave birth near dawn on a rainy Thursday. Jonah learned from a mutual friend and arrived at the hospital before noon. I saw him once through the glass doors near the maternity desk. His hair was wet, his shirt was half-buttoned, and he kept asking to see Sabrina. Lorraine met him before he reached the unit. Jonah had not established legal paternity and was not listed as someone Sabrina permitted to receive information. The staff could not tell him about the baby without her authorization. Lorraine made certain Sabrina would not give it. I entered Sabrina's room as our mother held out her phone. Sabrina had been crying. The baby had already been examined and was healthy, but Lorraine told her Jonah was downstairs demanding answers and threatening to take the child. That was not true? Elsie asked. I do not believe it was. Sabrina read the message Lorraine had written. The baby didn't make it. Please don't contact me again. I cannot send that, Sabrina whispered. Lorraine leaned closer. You can end this now, or you can spend the rest of your life fighting a boy with no money while everyone remembers what you did. Sabrina pressed send. The hospital gave Jonah no information. He left believing the message came from the girl he loved. A week later, I watched Lorraine place a hospital grief pamphlet and a note into an envelope for him. There was no death certificate, no forged government record, only enough sorrow-shaped paper to make a frightened 18-year-old stop asking questions. I told myself I had witnessed a cruel necessity. That lie was easier than admitting I had watched our mother erase a father. I held Elsie for the first time that afternoon. She was awake, healthy, and furious at the cold air outside her blanket. A clear bag of newborn belongings sat beside the bassinet. Inside it was a tiny silver bracelet with the letter E. Jonah had ordered it months earlier after he and Sabrina chose the name Elsie. I knew that because he had shown it to me at the library, embarrassed by how small it looked in his palm. Lorraine told me he wanted nothing to do with the baby. Sabrina turned her face toward the wall. I fastened it around Elsie's wrist for one photograph, then removed it because it was too loose. The original plan was temporary. I would care for Elsie for a few months while Sabrina recovered, completed school, and decided what she wanted. But weeks became a semester. Sabrina returned to class, then left for college. She stopped asking how often Elsie woke at night and began referring to her as the baby instead of by name. Lorraine told me Jonah had vanished. When the adoption papers arrived, no signed surrender from him was included. Paternity had never been legally established. The file listed an old address connected to his father's closed repair shop and recorded the biological father as unconfirmed and unreachable. I asked Lorraine why there was no document showing Jonah had refused his rights. She said, "Because there are no rights until he proves he is the father, and he has made no effort to do that." I asked whether we should search for him ourselves. Lorraine's expression hardened. "If you delay this, a court may decide the placement is unstable. Elsie could enter temporary foster care while they investigate. Is satisfying your curiosity worth losing her?" I was 26. Elsie slept against my chest every night and gripped my finger whenever she drank from a bottle. The possibility of losing her terrified me more than the missing signature troubled me. So I signed. I did not forge a name. I followed the process placed in front of me, but I also accepted the version that allowed me to keep Elsie, even after I saw a gap large enough to question. Back in the kitchen, Elsie wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. "Did you ever plan to tell me Sabrina was my mother?" Yes, I kept moving the age when I thought it would be safe. Safe for me? Or safe for you? The answer took too long. I was protecting both of us. She looked at the photograph again. Did you know my father thought I was dead? No. I swear I did not know that. Lorraine told me Jonah abandoned you before you were born. Elsie stepped away when I reached for her. I believe you did not know everything. That does not mean I forgive what you did know. I understand. No, you understand the words. I do not think you understand what it feels like to learn that everyone in your family was standing around a secret with your name on it. She carried the photograph upstairs and closed her bedroom door. I remained at the table, with the consent form beneath my hand. Then another memory surfaced, one I had dismissed because Sabrina had been exhausted and medicated when she said it. Just before Lorraine took her away from the hospital, Sabrina caught my wrist and whispered, "If Jonah comes back, tell him she lived." For 13 years, I had remembered that sentence as proof Sabrina was confused. I had never asked Lorraine whether Jonah came back. I did not call Lorraine the next morning. If I asked whether Jonah had returned, she would give me the version that protected her. I needed to find the man she had spent 13 years describing as someone who ran away. Elsie barely spoke to me over the next 3 days. She went to school, completed her homework, and ate dinner across from me, but every answer was stripped to its minimum. I did not push her to forgive me or accept another explanation. I had already decided for her often enough. After she went to bed each night, I searched through the boxes I had carried from Belmere when Lorraine sold our childhood home. Old report cards, photographs, recital programs, and letters covered the dining table. Jonah's surname appeared in the adoption file, but searching for Jonah Reed produced too many results to trust. On the third night, I found Sabrina's pregnancy notebook inside a box of college brochures. Lorraine had used it to record appointment dates, medications, and instructions. Most pages were written in my mother's tight, controlled handwriting. Near the back, Sabrina had written Jonah's full name and his father's repair shop number, beneath a list of possible baby names, Jonah Michael Reed. The old shop was gone, but an archived local newspaper article listed Jonah as a volunteer with Ashford Emergency Medical Services. A public professional directory confirmed that a Jonah M. Reed still worked as an EMT in Ashford. I did not call his workplace. I contacted a former library volunteer who had known him in high school and asked only whether the man in the directory was the same Jonah Reed. She replied the following afternoon, "Yes. Same Jonah. I haven't spoken to him in years, but I can send him your number and let him decide whether to call." He called at 9:42 that night. "Is this Camille Dawson?" His voice was lower than I remembered, but I recognized the caution in it. "Yes." There was a long silence. "You're Sabrina's sister." "I am. If she wants something, she can call me herself. She doesn't know I found you." Another pause followed. I could hear traffic and the faint electronic tone of a vehicle door closing. "Why are you calling?" I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Did anyone ever ask you to sign away your parental rights 13 years ago?" The line went so quiet that I checked whether the call had ended. "What parental rights?" he asked. "To Sabrina's baby." His breath changed. "The baby died." I closed my eyes. Until that moment, part of me had still hoped Lorraine's story and Jonah's story would somehow meet in the middle. "No," I said. "She didn't." Jonah did not speak for nearly a minute. When he finally did, his voice was unsteady. "Who are you talking about? I can't explain everything over the phone. There is a 13-year-old girl named Elsie. I have raised her since the day she was born." The name seemed to strike him harder than the rest. "Elsie?" "Yes." He ended the call without saying goodbye. 20 minutes later, a message appeared. "I need proof before I believe another person in your family." I sent him a redacted copy of the hospital photograph Gabriel had provided. I covered Elsie's present information and left visible only the date, Sabrina's face, the newborn, and the silver bracelet. Jonah called again before midnight. Where did you get that picture? Sabrina kept it. That bracelet belonged to my daughter. I did not correct the word. Can we meet? We chose Midway Diner, a roadside restaurant almost exactly between Hawthorne and Ashford. 4 days later, I drove 70 minutes through steady spring rain and found Jonah waiting in a booth near the back. He was thinner than the 18-year-old I remembered. His hair had darkened, and exhaustion had settled around his eyes in a way that made him look older than 31. A Navy Emergency Services jacket hung beside him. On the table sat a small cardboard box held shut, with faded tape. He stood when I approached, but did not offer his hand. Is she happy? He asked. It was not the question I expected. He did not ask whether Elsie knew about him, whether I had money, or whether he could claim a place in her life. Yes, I said. She was, before the wedding. Right now she is hurt and angry. At you? At all of us. He nodded as if that answer made sense. We sat, and he pushed the box toward the center of the table. This is what I kept. It is not much. Inside was a parking receipt from Cedar County Medical Center, dated the day Elsie was born. Jonah had arrived at 11:38 that morning and left shortly after 4. Beneath it lay a printed screenshot of the message sent from Sabrina's phone. The baby didn't make it. Please don't contact me again. I had heard those words in my memory. Seeing them printed made the lie feel newly committed. Jonah showed me a folded pamphlet from the hospital's infant loss support program. Lorraine had mailed it to him a week after the birth with a short typed note signed with Sabrina's name. Please let me grieve without you. There was no death certificate, he said. I asked Lorraine once. She said the hospital handled everything because Sabrina did not want a service. I called the hospital, but they would not tell me anything. I was not listed as family, and Sabrina had told them not to speak to me. Did you speak to a lawyer? I was 18. My father's shop was failing. I had less than $200, and everyone with authority was telling me the same thing. The hospital said they could not help. Lorraine said the baby was dead. Sabrina's phone confirmed it. His jaw tightened. I believed the person I loved. He removed a stack of sealed envelopes tied with string. Each was addressed only to my daughter. I wrote these for years. Birthdays, mostly. I never mailed them because I thought there was nowhere to send them. I touched the top envelope, but did not pick it up. What made you doubt the story? The dates. The pamphlet Lorraine sent was printed the year before. The hospital billing office once called my father's shop asking for Sabrina, but Lorraine had told me there were no bills because the baby never left intensive care. He looked down at his hands. Mostly, I doubted it because I knew Sabrina. Even if she hated me, she would have chosen a name. She would have told me where the baby was buried. He reached into the box and produced an order form from a small jewelry shop. A silver infant bracelet had been purchased 2 months before the birth. The engraving field contained one letter, A. We chose Elsie, he said. Sabrina liked names that sounded like they belonged in old books. I ordered the bracelet before we knew whether it would fit. She still has it. Jonah pressed his lips together and looked toward the rain-streaked window. 7 years earlier, he had sent Sabrina one final letter by certified delivery. He had addressed it to Lorraine's house because it was the only reliable address he knew. What did you write? I asked one question. Did your mother lie to me about our baby? The tracking system showed the envelope had been delivered. Jonah had printed the basic status page years ago, but it did not include the recipient's signature. He had never received a response. I might be able to access the old shipping account, he said. If the detailed record still exists, it may show who signed. Why did you wait 6 years to send it? Because doubt is easier when it is small. Once you ask the question, you have to survive the answer. He looked directly at me. Why didn't you find me? I could have blamed Lorraine, the incomplete file, or the fear she planted in me. All of those things were true, but none was the whole truth. I believed you left, I said. Then I noticed the adoption papers did not contain the surrender Lorraine claimed you had signed. I asked once, accepted her explanation, and stopped looking because I was afraid someone might take Elsie from me. Jonah did not forgive me. He did not accuse me either. So nobody searched for me because my absence made everyone else's life easier. The waitress approached, saw neither of us had touched the menus, and quietly moved away. I am sorry, I said. I know you raised her. I am not pretending that means nothing. He closed the box. But I grieved a living child for 13 years. Before we left, Jonah removed one envelope from the stack. The paper had yellowed at the edges. I wrote this the night before she was born. I am not asking you to open it. I am not asking you to give it to her today. It belongs to Elsie, so she decides. I placed the sealed letter inside my bag. He did not ask to follow me home. He did not demand a photograph or a meeting. He only asked me to tell him whether Elsie was safe after she learned the truth. When I returned to Hawthorne, the house was quiet. Elsie was sitting at the dining table with the gray records box open in front of her. An old photograph lay between her hands. It showed Jonah at 18 beside his father's repair shop, smiling awkwardly while Sabrina leaned against his shoulder. Elsie looked up at me. "Is that my father?" Elsie asked. I set my bag on the table and sat across from her. "His name is Jonah Reed. I met him today." Her eyes moved to the sealed envelope in my hand. "Did he know I was alive?" "No. Lorraine told him you died after you were born." A message came from Sabrina's phone, telling him not to contact her again, and the hospital would not give him information because he had not been legally established as your father. Elsie looked down at the photograph. Jonah was 18 in it, wearing a faded work shirt and smiling, as if he had not yet learned how quickly adults could rewrite a life. And Sabrina knew? She knew you were alive. I have not proved exactly when she learned Jonah believed you were dead. Jonah sent her a letter 6 years ago, asking whether Lorraine had lied to him, but we do not yet know whether Sabrina personally received it. What do you know? The question was not angry. It was more difficult than anger, because it required me to separate facts from every explanation I had inherited. I know Sabrina gave birth to you. I know Jonah is your biological father. I know Lorraine told me Jonah abandoned you, while she told him you had died. I know I always knew Sabrina was your biological mother. I did not know Jonah thought you were dead, but I knew the records did not contain the signed surrender Lorraine claimed existed. I asked one question, accepted her answer, and stopped searching. Elsie's mouth tightened. You always told me our family did not keep secrets. I know. You said adults should tell children the truth, in a way they can understand. I said that because I believed it. I failed to live by it when the truth threatened something I was afraid to lose. Her gaze sharpened. Me? Yes. The word did not excuse me, but it was the answer she deserved. I was afraid that if I told you Sabrina was your mother, you would look at her differently. I was afraid she might change her mind, or Jonah might appear, or a court might question the adoption. I was also afraid you might love one of them more, and decide I was only the person who raised you while you waited for your real family. Elsie flinched at the phrase. You are my real family. I am your mother because I raised you and stayed. But I cannot use that truth to erase the people you came from, or to decide what you are allowed to know. She pushed the photograph away. All of you decided what I could handle. Lorraine decided I could handle not having a father. Sabrina decided I could handle being treated like a stranger. You decided I could handle a lie better than the truth. Yes. Are you going to keep agreeing with me until I stop being angry? No. You can stay angry as long as you need. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I placed Jonah's sealed letter on the table. Her name was not written on the front. The envelope said only my daughter in handwriting that had faded but remained careful. He wrote this the night before you were born. He gave it to me because he believes it belongs to you. I have not opened it. Elsie touched one corner of the envelope. Do you want me to read it? What I want is not the point. She studied me, perhaps testing whether I meant it. Then she slid the letter toward herself without breaking the seal. I want to meet him once. My stomach tightened, but I did not argue. All right. I choose where. The small program room at the library after closing, because I know the building and there are cameras in the hallway. That is reasonable. Sabrina and Lorraine cannot know. They will not hear it from me. You do not answer questions for me. If I cannot answer something, I will say so. I understand. And he does not hug me unless he asks first. I will tell him before he arrives. She picked up the letter and carried it upstairs. The seal remained intact. 3 evenings later, I locked the library's front doors at 7 and led Elsie into the small program room where I usually hosted reading groups. The room held a round table, 6 chairs, a water dispenser, and a shelf of board games. Its plainness was deliberate. I did not want their first meeting to occur in a restaurant where strangers might listen, or in our home where Jonah's presence could feel like an invasion. He arrived 5 minutes early and waited outside until I opened the side entrance. He wore dark jeans and a clean gray shirt rather than his emergency services uniform. The cardboard box from the diner was not with him. Before we entered, I reminded him of Elsie's rules. I will follow everyone, he said. If she asks me to leave, I leave. Elsie was standing beside the window when we entered. She had put the silver bracelet back on, though the letter remained inside her backpack. Jonah stopped several feet away. His face changed when he saw her, but he did not step forward. Hello, Elsie, he said. Thank you for agreeing to meet me. She looked at him for a long time. Do you think I look like Sabrina? You have some of her features. Your eyes look like my mother's. Is she alive? She is. She does not know about you yet. I will not tell anyone unless you say I can. Elsie sat, and Jonah took the chair across from her. I chose one near the wall, far enough away that I was present, without sitting between them. Why did you stop looking? Elsie asked. Jonah lowered his hands to the table. Because I was 18, frightened, and poor. I did not understand what legal rights I might have had. The hospital would not speak to me. Your grandmother told me you had died, and a message from Sabrina confirmed it. I believed them because they were older and sounded certain. You sent a letter later. I did. By then I had spent years telling myself doubt was only grief. When I finally asked Sabrina whether Lorraine had lied, no one answered. I should have followed up. I should have hired someone, searched public records, or kept asking until a door opened. Why didn't you? I was afraid the answer would be that you really had died. I was also afraid I had waited so long that I no longer had the right to disturb Sabrina's life. Those fears do not make my decision good. They only explain it. Elsie nodded once. She did not comfort him. Did you choose my name? Your mother and I chose it together. Sabrina liked the name Elsie because of a character in an old novel. I liked it because my grandmother was named Elise, but I did not want you to feel as if you had been named after someone you never met. Would you want me to change it if she chose it? No. Your name belongs to you now. Everything about your life belongs to you. Elsie pulled back her sleeve and showed him the bracelet. Jonah's breath caught, but he kept his hands on his side of the table. I ordered that before you were born, he said. It looked impossibly small when I picked it up. Sabrina told me to remove it before the wedding photographs. His expression hardened, then softened again before he spoke. I am sorry she did that. You do not have to apologize for her. You are right. She opened her backpack and placed the sealed letter on the table. I have not read this yet. You never have to. I might. That is your decision. The meeting lasted 42 minutes. Elsie asked about Jonah's work, whether he had other children, and whether he had ever married. He answered that he worked ambulance shifts, had no other children, and had never married. He did not offer a tragic explanation for every year of his life. He simply answered what she asked. When it was time to leave, Jonah stood, but did not reach for her. May I see you again sometime? He asked. I do not know yet. That is fair. Elsie slipped the letter back into her bag. She still did not call him Dad. She held herself together until we reached the car. Then she sat in the passenger seat and began to cry, quietly at first, then with her whole body. I wanted to pull her toward me, but when I moved my hand from the steering wheel, she shook her head. "Please don't." I placed my hand back in my lap. "I'm here." She cried until she could breathe evenly again. Then I drove us home without asking her to explain what the meeting had changed. Lorraine was waiting on our front porch when we arrived. She rose as soon as the headlights crossed the yard and looked at Elsie's backpack before turning to me. "If Jonah challenges that adoption," she said, "you could lose her." "If Jonah challenges that adoption," Lorraine said, "you could lose her." Elsie stopped beside the car, her face still swollen from crying. My mother stood beneath the porch light in a cream coat, composed enough to make the threat sound like practical advice. "You followed us here to frighten her?" I asked. "I came to prevent you from destroying what little stability remains." Lorraine glanced at Elsie. "Go inside, sweetheart. Your mother and I need to discuss adult matters." Elsie tightened her grip on her backpack. "The adult matters are about me." Lorraine's mouth hardened. This is exactly what happens when children are given information before they are emotionally prepared. I stepped between them. "You do not get to decide what she is prepared for anymore. She is 13, Camille. You knew Sabrina was her mother and kept the child anyway. If Jonah finds a lawyer willing to claim fraud, he can say you participated in taking his daughter." The words struck the fear she had planted years earlier. I felt it, but I no longer mistook fear for proof. "Jonah has not threatened me," I said. "He will once someone explains what he can gain." "You still think every relationship is a transaction." Lorraine lowered her voice. "I am offering you a solution. Keep Jonah away from Elsie. Sabrina will apologize privately for what she said. Gabriel can be persuaded to stop circulating medical information, and the family will present the wedding incident as an emotional misunderstanding. No lawyers, no public accusations, no court reviewing how you obtained custody." Elsie moved around me and unlocked the front door. Before entering, she looked back at Lorraine. Aunt Sabrina did not misunderstand anything. Lorraine's expression flickered, but Elsie closed the door before she could answer. I remained on the porch. "You are not coming inside. I protected all three of you. You protected the future you chose for Sabrina, and you received the child you could not have on your own." The cruelty of the sentence was deliberate. Lorraine had always known which private wound to press when reason stopped working. "I did not receive a gift," I said. "I raised a person. You treated her like an object you could move from one daughter's life into another. If you had refused, she might have entered foster care. Or Jonah might have raised her. Or Sabrina might have made a different decision if you had stopped controlling every voice in the room." Lorraine's gaze shifted toward the house. "Be careful, Camille. A court may not view your choices as kindly as you do. Then I will ask someone who understands the law, instead of someone who uses it as a threat." I watched her drive away, before going inside. The next morning, I contacted the Employee Assistance Program, available to city workers. The first 30 minutes with a family law attorney were free. I used them explaining the adoption, Jonah's missing relinquishment, Lorraine's false address, and the fact that the placement had remained uncontested for 13 years. The attorney, Marisol Grant, did not reassure me with promises. She asked which documents I possessed, whether Jonah had been legally identified as the father, whether he wanted to change custody, and what Elsie currently understood. When the free session ended, I paid $325 from my emergency account to continue for another hour. Watching the balance fall hurt, but uncertainty had already cost my daughter more than that. Marisol explained that evidence of deception did not automatically erase a 13-year adoption. Any attempt to change Elsie's legal status would require formal proceedings, proof of standing, an explanation for the delay, and an examination of Elsie's present interests. Jonah's lack of notice could matter, but so could his later inaction, the final adoption order, my years as Elsie's parent, and Elsie's own age and wishes. So no one can simply arrive and take her? I asked. Not simply, Marisol said. But I will not tell you there is no legal risk before reviewing the full file and knowing the jurisdictional history. Do not destroy anything. Preserve messages, delivery records, court papers, and the documents Gabriel provided. Do not post Elsie's medical or adoption information online, even if Sabrina speaks publicly first. She also advised that Jonah obtain independent counsel if he wanted legal guidance. Ki Yao Saos. You for Yao advised that Jonah obtain anyone from claiming we had coordinated a story. I left with no guarantee, but Lorraine's threat had lost its magical power. There was a process between fear and consequence. That afternoon, I asked Lorraine to meet me at a quiet cafe near the municipal offices. I chose a public place because she behaved differently when other people could observe her, though she still selected the chair facing the door. I consulted an attorney, I said. Her fingers paused around her coffee cup. You are escalating this unnecessarily. I need you to tell me exactly what happened when Jonah came to the hospital. I told you what happened. You told me he abandoned Sabrina. Jonah has the parking receipt from the day Elsie was born. He was there for more than 4 hours. Lorraine looked toward the window. He was an 18-year-old boy with no money, no training, and a father whose business was collapsing. That is not an answer. He would have tied Sabrina to a life she had already outgrown. So you told him the baby died. I ended a situation none of you were capable of managing. The admission arrived without apology. You mailed him an infant loss pamphlet. I gave him closure. You gave him grief. I gave him the opportunity to begin again. You got to become a mother. Sabrina finished school and built a future. Jonah was free to do the same. And Elsie? She was loved. By me. Not because of you. Lorraine's face tightened. Do not pretend you objected to the outcome. You signed the papers. I did. And I will spend the rest of my life being honest about the part fear played in that decision. But you divided our lives as though you were distributing property. Sabrina received a future. I received a child. Jonah received a lie. And Elsie received a family history with half the names erased. Her cup touched the saucer with a small click. At the wedding, I said, when Sabrina called Elsie a burden, you said, just like her mother. Which mother did you mean? Lorraine did not answer. Did you mean me? Because you wanted the room to believe I had been abandoned? Or did you mean Sabrina? Because you knew the woman rejecting Elsie was the same woman who gave birth to her. Her silence confirmed that the sentence had never been careless. It had been designed to wound me while reminding Sabrina of the secret Lorraine still controlled. You both knew exactly what you were doing, I said. Sabrina was humiliated and frightened. She was 30 years old, holding a microphone. Lorraine rose. When this becomes public, do not expect me to protect you. You have never protected me. You protected the version of our family that required me to remain silent. By the time I returned home, Sabrina had posted a statement. She did not mention Elsie's name. She described herself as a woman forced, while still a minor, to surrender a child under family pressure. She accused me of taking advantage of her vulnerability and occupying a maternal role that should never have belonged to me. She said Gabriel had exposed private medical history during the most important day of her life, and that members of her family had used the wedding to punish her for trauma she had never been allowed to process. The statement was carefully written. Every sentence contained enough truth to support the lie around it. Comments multiplied beneath it. Some people condemned her speech, but others called her a survivor. Several accused Gabriel of violating her privacy. One woman wrote that adoptive relatives often erased young mothers and then portrayed them as unstable when they tried to speak. I could have answered with the hospital photograph, my letter, the adoption file, and Jonah's message. I could have shown the world that Sabrina had spent years avoiding Elsie while I handled every ordinary responsibility of motherhood. Instead, I closed the page. Elsie found the post on her own. She read it at the kitchen table, her expression growing still. She calls me the child placed with another family, she said. She cannot even say I am her daughter. She may be trying to avoid exposing your identity. She exposed enough to make strangers argue about who owns me. I sat beside her, but did not touch her. I am not posting your records to defend myself. People will believe her. Some will. You are okay with that? No. But winning an argument is not worth turning your birth, your adoption, and your father's grief into public evidence. Elsie looked back at Sabrina's statement. She abandoned me twice. The first time she was 17 and afraid. This time she stood in front of everyone and chose to do it. My phone vibrated against the table. The message was from Jonah. I got into the old shipping account. The detailed delivery certificate was still archived. I am sending the PDF now. An attachment appeared beneath his message. The certified letter had been delivered 7 years earlier to Lorraine's address. The page listed the date, the exact time, and the electronic signature of the recipient. I opened the PDF. Received by Sabrina Dawson. The delivery certificate removed the last place Sabrina could hide. Jonah's letter had reached Lorraine's house 7 years earlier. Someone had signed for it at 2:14 on a Tuesday afternoon, and the archived record named that person clearly, Sabrina Dawson. I sent the certificate to Marisol, along with Jonah's copy of the letter. He had written only one page. Did your mother lie to me about our baby? I need to know whether I have spent 6 years mourning a child who is still alive. Marisol arranged a private meeting 4 days later. Elsie did not attend. I would not place her in a room where the adults who had shaped her past argued about whose pain mattered most. Jonah also stayed away. He said Sabrina deserved to answer the question without using his presence as an excuse to turn the meeting into a custody fight. The conference room was small and windowless. Sabrina sat beside her attorney at one end of the table. Lorraine was not invited. Gabriel occupied the chair nearest the door, because he had agreed to confirm only what he had personally witnessed and then leave. Sabrina wore a navy suit instead of the white dress in which I had last seen her. Without the veil, flowers, and carefully arranged lighting, she looked younger and more tired. For a moment, I saw the 17-year-old girl who had cried in my apartment while holding a positive pregnancy test. Then she looked at me and said, "You finally got what you wanted. I wanted Elsie to leave your wedding without being publicly humiliated. You wanted everyone to see me as a monster, so you could remain the heroic sister who took my baby." Her attorney touched her wrist, but Sabrina pulled away. "I was 17, she continued. Mom controlled my phone, my medical appointments, and every person allowed near me. She decided the baby would go to you, before anyone asked what I wanted. You walked out of the hospital holding my daughter, and everyone praised you for saving her. I know Lorraine controlled you," I said. "I know you were frightened and denied a real choice. I also know I accepted a process I should have questioned more carefully." Sabrina's expression shifted, as if she had prepared for resistance but not agreement. "You should have given her back when I was ready." "When were you ready?" She opened her mouth, then stopped. "At 18? I asked. "At 21? At 23, when Jonah's letter arrived? At 30, when you ordered Elsie out of your family photographs? I did not know what that letter contained before I signed for it." Marisol placed the delivery certificate on the table. "No one has claimed the signature proves what you knew before opening the envelope. The question is what you did afterward." Sabrina stared at the paper. "You read it," I said. Her attorney leaned toward her. Sabrina ignored him. "Yes," she said. "I read it." Gabriel lowered his eyes. He had known enough to end the wedding, but the admission seemed to close something inside him. "What did you do?" I asked. "I drove to Ashford." The answer surprised me, though it did not soften what followed. Sabrina had found Jonah's workplace through an online directory. She drove 2 hours and parked across from the ambulance station near the end of his shift. She watched him come outside carrying a paper cup, speak to another EMT, and climb into an old sedan. "Why didn't you approach him?" I asked. because I had spent 6 years believing he moved on. Then I saw him, and suddenly, I was 17 again. I could hear Mom telling me he would take Elsie, that you would lose her, that every good thing we had built would collapse. He was asking whether his child was alive. I know what he asked. You let him continue believing she was dead. Sabrina pressed her fingertips against her temples. At first, I told myself I needed time. Then a week passed, then a month. Every year after that, telling him became worse because I would also have to explain why I had waited. So you chose the silence again. I chose not to destroy 3 lives over a decision I did not make. You did not make the first decision, I said. You made every decision after you learned the truth. Her face tightened. You think being 23 made me free? Mom still controlled the family. You had Elsie. Jonah had built another life. What was I supposed to do? Appear and announce that everyone had been living a lie? Yes. You were supposed to tell the truth and accept that you could not control what happened next. Gabriel spoke for the first time. That is what you asked me to do every time we discussed marriage. You said honesty mattered even when it was expensive. Sabrina turned toward him. I was going to tell you. When? After the wedding. You told me the baby died. Then, when you knew I had begun questioning that story, you used your wedding speech to call Elsie fatherless. Sabrina looked down at the table. Gabriel continued. I did not cancel the ceremony because you became pregnant at 17. I would not have judged you for that. I ended it because you lied to me, denied a living child, and deliberately humiliated her in front of a room full of adults. I panicked, Sabrina said. You prepared that speech. Her eyes filled. I thought if everyone heard me call her my niece, if I sounded certain enough, you would stop wondering. The confession made the cruelty more precise. You thought if you were cold enough to Elsie, I said, no one would believe you were her mother. Sabrina nodded once. You used her pain as evidence for your lie. I did not expect the room to react that way. You called a 13-year-old girl a burden no one would ever want. What reaction did you expect? She looked toward Gabriel. I was terrified of losing you. You lost me before you took the microphone, he said. The speech only showed me why. Sabrina reached across the table, but he stood before she could touch him. Please don't leave, she said. We can postpone everything. I will go to therapy. I will tell you whatever you want to know. This is not about satisfying my questions anymore. He nodded to Marisol, then to me. He did not look back when Sabrina called his name again. The door closed behind him, leaving her hand extended over the empty chair. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Sabrina's attorney opened a folder. My client is prepared to discuss a private resolution that protects the minor involved. Sabrina offered to establish a college fund for Elsie. She would issue an apology for the wedding speech, but would not publicly identify herself as Elsie's biological mother. She would leave our lives entirely if I agreed to state that online speculation about her connection to Elsie was false. She also wanted me to keep Jonah away. He is unstable after what happened, she said. You cannot know what he will demand. He has demanded nothing, I replied. He will. You are still trying to decide everyone's future before they are allowed to speak. I am offering Elsie financial security. Money does not buy the right to define her history. Sabrina's voice sharpened. You think you have that right because you raised her. I used to think raising her gave me the right to decide when she could know the truth. I was wrong. I will not repeat that mistake for your benefit. Marisol placed our conditions on the table. Sabrina had to remove the statement accusing me of exploiting her vulnerability. Any correction must acknowledge that her claims about my conduct were inaccurate without revealing Elsie's identity, adoption records, or medical history. She was to stop contacting Elsie directly, unless Elsie requested it. If she continued public accusations or private pressure, we would use the appropriate legal channels concerning harassment, privacy, and false statements. There would be no public spectacle from me. But there would also be no new family lie. Sabrina looked at the delivery certificate again. If I agree, are you going to tell everyone I'm her mother? No. Elsie's history is not mine to publish. Will you tell Jonah to stay away from her? No. Her face crumpled with anger and fear. Then what exactly do I get? The opportunity to stop causing more harm. She stared at me as if I had offered nothing. Then her voice dropped. Does Elsie know I'm her mother? She knows who gave birth to her, I said. Whether she ever calls you her mother is no longer your decision. Sabrina removed her statement the following morning. By noon, she had replaced it with 4 carefully worded paragraphs, acknowledging that she had made inaccurate claims about my conduct and had spoken about a minor in a way that was harmful and inappropriate. She did not identify Elsie, mention the adoption, or admit publicly that she had given birth to her. It was not the confession strangers wanted. It was the correction Elsie needed. Gabriel released a statement of his own through the wedding venue. He said the ceremony had been canceled before it began because of serious concerns involving honesty and conduct toward a child. He asked guests not to circulate photographs, video, or speculation about any minor who had attended. He did not mention Sabrina's pregnancy. He did not name Elsie. He did not turn private records into proof that he had been right. The school where Sabrina worked received several complaints from parents who had attended the wedding. At least 2 guests submitted video showing the speech before Gabriel ordered the phones lowered. Others gave written accounts. Human Resources placed Sabrina on administrative leave from duties involving direct contact with parents while the school investigated. No one fired her that afternoon. No police arrived at her apartment. The consequences moved through meetings, policies, and interviews, rather than the dramatic punishment people online demanded. The investigation concerned her decision to publicly humiliate a 13-year-old while holding a position built on trust with families. It did not concern the fact that she had become pregnant at 17. That distinction mattered to me, even if Sabrina refused to see it. Marisol sent Lorraine a formal notice, requiring her to preserve every document, message, address record, and piece of correspondence connected to Elsie's birth and adoption. Destroying anything after receiving the notice could create consequences. Lorraine could not explain away as a family misunderstanding. I also told her in writing that she was not to contact Elsie directly, visit our home, appear at school, or send messages through relatives. Any future communication had to go through me or Marisol. Lorraine replied with one sentence. You are letting a frightened child dictate the destruction of this family. I did not answer. Losing control was the first consequence my mother had ever been unable to negotiate. Elsie avoided the internet during those days. She knew enough to understand people were arguing about us, but she did not search for every opinion. Instead, she carried Jonah's sealed letter from her bedroom to the kitchen and back again without opening it. On Sunday afternoon, she placed it on the table between us. I want you here while I read it, she said, but I do not want you to read over my shoulder. I sat at the opposite end of the table. Elsie slid one finger beneath the old seal and unfolded 2 pages written 13 years earlier. She read silently at first. Her eyes slowed near the middle, and her thumb pressed against the edge of the paper. What does he say? I asked only after she looked up. He says he is scared. She turned the first page around without handing it to me. Jonah's handwriting was narrower then, the letters carefully shaped as though he had expected his child to examine them one day. He had written the letter the night before Sabrina's scheduled induction. He admitted he had no idea how to hold a newborn, calm a fever, or earn enough money to support 3 people. He said he was afraid Sabrina would eventually realize love was not enough to fix everything he lacked. Then he wrote that fear did not mean he wanted to leave. He planned to begin emergency medical training, work nights, and learn every task a father was supposed to know. He promised he would not pretend to have answers he did not have. Near the bottom of the second page, Jonah described the bracelet. Your mother and I keep changing our minds about names, but every name we love begins with E. I bought a bracelet with 1 letter, so it will still belong to you when we finally decide who you are. Elsie stopped reading and pushed back the sleeve of her sweater. The bracelet was not there. She had left it upstairs since the wedding. "He expected me," she said. "Yes. He was scared, but he still expected me." Yes. For years, Lorraine had used Jonah's absence as evidence that Elsie was unwanted. The letter proved something more complicated and more human. Jonah had been young, frightened, and uncertain, but he had imagined a future in which his daughter existed. Elsie folded the pages along their original creases. "I want to see him again." Their second meeting took place at the library the following Thursday. This time, Elsie brought a notebook filled with questions. She asked Jonah whether heart disease ran in his family, whether his mother had allergies, and whether anyone on his side had migraines. He answered carefully and promised to obtain records when he did not know. Then she moved beyond medical history. "What were you like in school?" "Quiet until someone annoyed me." "Were you good at anything?" "Fixing engines and failing chemistry." "What did your mother do?" "She taught 3rd grade for 34 years. "Do I have cousins?" "2. They do not know about you." "Would you tell them?" "Only if you decide you want them to know." Elsie wrote each answer down. Jonah did not act offended by the notebook or ask why she needed proof of every statement. He understood that adults had taught her to distrust unrecorded promises. Near the end of the hour, she closed the notebook. "You can text me once a week," she said. "Not every day, and not late at night. Mom sees the number first." Jonah nodded. "Once a week. I may not answer right away." "That is fine. And I am not calling you Dad. You do not owe me a title." His acceptance changed something in Elsie's posture. She did not move closer or offer a hug. But when he left, she watched through the glass until his car disappeared from the parking lot. That night, I sat on the edge of her bed while she reorganized the photographs on her wall. She had removed the wedding invitation and left a pale rectangle where it used to hang. "Do you want to change anything?" I asked. "Your last name, where we live, the way we handle contact with Jonah. Nothing has to change, but nothing is forbidden from changing either." Elsie studied me. "Do you want me to change my name?" "No. I want you to know it is yours. Camille Dawson is still my mother." Relief rose so quickly that it almost became gratitude, but I stopped myself from making her words responsible for comforting me. "I am your mother because you stayed," she continued. "Not because Sabrina signed something or because Jonah was gone. But there is a rule now." "What rule?" "No more secrets because you think they will protect me. You can wait until we are somewhere safe to tell me something, but you cannot decide I never get to know." "I agree. If the truth scares you, you still tell me." "I will." 2 days later, Sabrina asked Marisol for permission to meet Elsie. She offered to do it with a counselor present and said she wanted the opportunity to explain what had happened when she was 17. I read the request to Elsie without adding my opinion. She shook her head. "Not now. Do you want to send a reply?" She thought for several minutes, then dictated while I wrote. "You gave birth to me. Camille raised me. Jonah grieved me. Grandma erased me. I need time to decide what you are to me." Elsie read the message twice before allowing Marisol to send it. She did not add that she forgave Sabrina, loved her, or wanted a relationship later. She left the future open without promising it. That evening, Elsie came downstairs wearing the silver bracelet for the first time since the wedding. She had polished the small letter E until it reflected the kitchen light. "Are you sure you want to wear it?" I asked. "Sabrina does not own it just because she held me first. Lorraine does not own it because she kept the truth. Jonah bought it, but he said it belongs to me." She turned her wrist, watching the letter slide along the chain. "I am keeping it because it proves somebody expected me before all of you started lying." The sentence hurt, but it also returned the bracelet to the only person who had the right to define it. As summer moved toward fall, Jonah kept his promise. One message arrived every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes Elsie answered with a full paragraph. Sometimes she sent one word. Once she did not answer at all, and he waited until the following week. Near the end of August, She brought me a flyer for the student art exhibition scheduled at her school in October. Her painting had been selected for the main hallway. She placed the flyer on the kitchen counter and looked at me. "Can Jonah come?" I did not ask whether inviting him meant she had forgiven him, accepted him, or chosen him over anyone else. "That is your invitation to give," I told Elsie. She sent Jonah a photograph of the exhibition flyer that evening. His reply arrived 9 minutes later. "I would be honored to come. I will wait for you to tell me where to stand." By October, nearly 8 months had passed since Sabrina's wedding. Time had not restored our lives to what they had been, and neither Elsie nor I wanted it to. We attended family counseling twice a month, sometimes together and sometimes separately. There were sessions when Elsie spoke calmly about school, Jonah, or the rules she wanted at home. There were other sessions when she became angry all over again, because I had known the truth while watching Sabrina treat her like an unwanted guest. I stopped asking when the anger would end. I learned to answer what she asked, admit what I did not know, and remain present when my apology could not repair the moment. Trust returned through smaller choices than I had expected. Before telling a colleague why I needed to leave work early, I asked Elsie how much she wanted shared. When a letter arrived from Sabrina's attorney, I placed it unopened on Elsie's desk. When Jonah asked whether she wanted him at a school event, I passed along the question instead of accepting for her. Those decisions would have seemed ordinary to anyone outside our home. To us, they were evidence that no adult was quietly rewriting Elsie's life again. Jonah followed the schedule she set. They met twice a month, usually at the library or a cafe near the park. He attended a school concert and sat 3 rows behind me because Elsie had assigned the seats herself. He never contradicted my rules, arrived without warning, or acted as though biological connection gave him authority he had not earned. At the concert, one of Elsie's friends asked who he was. Elsie answered, "That's Jonah, my biological father." The title made something move across his face, but he only smiled and said, "It's nice to meet you." He did not ask for more. Gabriel wrote to Elsie once. The letter came through Marisol, so no one could accuse him of forcing contact. He apologized for allowing his suspicions to remain unresolved until the wedding and for speaking about Sabrina's medical history in a room where Elsie's private life could be inferred. He wrote that stopping Sabrina did not make him brave enough to deserve gratitude. It was simply the minimum an adult should have done when a child was being harmed. Elsie replied with 3 sentences. "Thank you for taking the microphone away. I wish you had spoken to Mom earlier. You stopped Sabrina, but Mom and I saved ourselves afterward." Gabriel accepted the correction. Sabrina did not return to her former role in parent relations. After the school completed its review, she agreed to transfer into an administrative position without direct responsibility for families. Several months later, she resigned and moved to another district. She began therapy and mentioned it in one of her letters, but Elsie's counselor helped her understand that treatment was not a receipt proving Sabrina had changed. Therapy could explain what she was confronting. It could not erase what she had chosen. Sabrina sent 4 letters through Marisol. Elsie read the first and stored the other 3 unopened in a box beneath her desk. She said she might read them later, or might never read them at all. I did not tell her which choice would be kinder. Lorraine continued to insist that she had saved everyone from a worse life. Her packages arrived at Marisol's office because she was no longer allowed to appear at our home, the library, or Elsie's school without permission. Elsie returned 2 gifts, kept a book, and placed 1 birthday card in the same box as Sabrina's letters. She did not confuse accepting an object with restoring a relationship. On the evening of the exhibition, Elsie stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the silver bracelet. She wore black trousers, a green blouse, and the expression of someone trying not to reveal how much the night mattered. "Jonah is already at the school," I said. "He asked whether he should wait outside. Tell him he can come in, but he should not stand beside the painting before I get there." I sent the message exactly as she gave it to me. The main hallway had been transformed into a gallery. Student paintings covered temporary white walls beneath strings of warm lights. Parents moved slowly between them, while teachers offered paper cups of cider. Jonah waited near the entrance. He greeted me, then allowed Elsie to decide the distance between them. She gave him a small wave and led us toward the center wall. Her painting was larger than I expected. Against a muted blue background, 4 places had been marked by hands. 1 pair belonged to me. I recognized the small burn scar near my thumb and the faint ink stain I often carried home from work. Elsie's hands were beside mine, not held tightly but resting close enough that the fingertips nearly touched. Jonah's hands appeared on the other side. They were larger, marked with the shallow cuts and roughened skin of his work. They did not reach across the painting to claim Elsie. 1 palm remained open, waiting. The 4th place contained no hands. Elsie had painted only a pale outline and a field of unfinished color. The empty shape was not crossed out, hidden, or covered. It remained visible without being filled. Several visitors stopped to study the painting. The card beneath it gave the title, Terms of Belonging. Jonah read the title twice. "It is beautiful." Elsie nodded. "Thank you." He did not ask whether the open place belonged to Sabrina. Neither did I until we were alone beside the painting, and Jonah had stepped away to speak with Elsie's art teacher. "What does the empty space mean?" I asked. Elsie traced the air near the unfinished outline without touching the canvas. "It is not forgiveness," she said. "It is not punishment either." "Then what is it?" She looked at me. "It means I get to choose when someone belongs there." The answer carried no promise that Sabrina would one day occupy the space. It also carried no final sentence handed down by a frightened 13-year-old. The absence belonged to Elsie, just as the bracelet, the letters, her name, and her history belonged to her. Her painting received a student recognition award, though that mattered less to her than hearing 2 younger students debate whether the unfinished space made the picture sad or hopeful. Elsie told them it could be both. When the exhibition ended, she took my hand as we walked toward the parking lot. Jonah followed several steps behind, neither assuming he belonged beside us, nor withdrawing so far that she would have to search for him. We reached the doors before Elsie noticed the distance. She looked back. "Jonah, are you coming?" His face softened. "If you want me to." I asked, didn't I? He caught up, but did not move between us. Elsie kept my hand in hers, while leaving enough space on her other side for him to walk beside her. She still did not call him Dad. Sabrina's place in the painting remained unfinished. Lorraine remained outside the boundaries she had once controlled. Nothing about us resembled the complete family Sabrina had displayed at her wedding. But no one in that hallway was being assigned a role without consent. Elsie had never been fatherless. She had been kept from the truth, and that was the only inheritance I refused to pass on.